Help me! They took all my clothes!" A fat girl begged the most feared mountain man, out in the freezing dark, with nothing but snow and shame around her. Everyone said he was a killer, a brute, a man to run from. But when she stumbled half dead into his cabin, the night took a turn no one could have imagined. Wrapped in his buffalo robe, she whispered the truth. The thieves hadn't just stolen her clothes. They stole her family's land deed, the only thing standing between her people and ruin. And now, with the railroad's greed closing in, the most feared man in the mountains must decide: stay hidden in his solitude, or fight beside the one soul brave enough to believe in him. But mercy carries a price. The law is crooked, enemies grow bold, and the church bell tolls for judgment. What happens when the most mocked girl and the most dangerous man stand together against a town bought and paid for? Will shame and fear bury them, or will faith and courage rewrite their fate? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The wind howled through the cracks of Ephraim Cutter's cabin like a hungry wolf. Inside, the mountain man's weathered hands moved with surprising gentleness as he added another log to the fire. The flames caught quickly, sending shadows dancing across the rough-hewn walls. Sally huddled beneath the buffalo robe, her bare feet stretched toward the warmth, her cheeks still wet with tears. "Ain't proper to ask," Ephraim's deep voice rumbled, keeping his eyes fixed on the fire. "But them that did this to you." He left the question hanging in the air. Sally pulled the robe tighter, her fingers clutching the thick fur. "Drifters," she whispered. "5 of them, led by a man called Pike." Her voice caught. They took everything. The wagon, Pa's winter supplies, even my—" She couldn't finish, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. Ephraim's scarred face remained impassive, but his knuckles whitened around the poker. He'd heard of Pike and his gang, troublemakers who'd been stirring up problems since the railroad survey crews arrived. The mountain man set the poker aside and moved to a wooden chest in the corner, his movements deliberate and quiet despite his massive frame. "Here." He pulled out a worn dress and boots, probably left by some long-gone settler's wife. "Ain't much, but they're clean." He placed them beside her, then turned his broad back. "I'll tend the horses. Take your time." Sally watched him duck through the low doorway, his shoulders nearly filling the frame. The dress was simple calico, faded but sturdy. As she dressed, her hands still trembling, she couldn't help but wonder about the man who'd taken her in. Ephraim Cutter's reputation reached even to her father's ranch, tales of violence, of men who'd crossed him and disappeared into the mountains. Yet his touch had been gentle when he'd helped. Her inside, and his eyes, when they met hers, held more sorrow than menace. The boots were a size too large, but thick wool socks from the chest made them wearable. By the time Ephraim returned, stamping snow from his boots, Sally sat composed before the fire, though her heart still raced at every sound from outside. "Much obliged, Mr. Cutter," she said softly. "I don't know what would have happened if—" "Ephraim," he corrected, moving to the crude kitchen area. He pulled down a tin of coffee and 2 battered cups. "Just Ephraim out here." Sally watched as he prepared the coffee with practiced movements. His silence didn't feel threatening now, but rather like the quiet of the mountains themselves, deep and somehow reassuring. The cabin, though sparse, showed signs of long habitation, dried herbs hanging from the rafters, well-maintained tools on the walls, a shelf of worn books beside the single bed. "You're Sarah Jane Brookfield," he said finally, handing her a steaming cup. It wasn't a question. Thomas Brookfield's girl, from the Double B. She nodded, surprised. Most folks call me Sally. You know our ranch? Know of it. He settled into a chair that creaked beneath his weight. Your pa's been fighting the railroad trying to keep his water rights. His eyes, the color of winter sky, studied her face. Them drifters. They say anything about that? Sally's hands tightened around the warm cup as memory crashed over her. They were laughing about it. Said Pa was fool enough to think he could stop progress. Her voice strengthened with anger. Pike said we'd learn soon enough that nothing stands in the way of the railroad's plans. Ephraim's expression darkened. He'd seen it before. Corporate men using hired thugs to drive honest folks from their land. It was why he'd retreated to these heights, why his own hands were stained with blood he could never wash clean. But looking at Sally's brave face, seeing how she fought to master her fear and shame, something long dormant stirred in his chest. You need rest, he said, rising. Take the bed. I'll keep watch. I couldn't possibly... Sally began to protest, but exhaustion made her sway where she sat. Ain't no arguing up here, Ephraim said firmly. Sleep. You're safe enough. Sally wanted to resist, but the events of the day crashed over her like a wave. The terror of the attack, the humiliation, the desperate flight through the snow, it all seemed to press down at once. She managed 3 steps toward the bed before her legs gave way. Ephraim caught her before she could fall, his strong arms steady and sure. For a moment she leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of him, smelling leather and wood smoke. Then she straightened, fighting down a blush. Thank you, she whispered. For everything. He only nodded, helping her to the bed. Sally sank into the rough blankets, still wrapped in the buffalo robe. Despite her fear that sleep would bring nightmares, her eyes grew heavy as soon as her head touched the pillow. Ephraim returned to his chair by the fire, rifle across his knees. Outside, the wind continued to moan, and somewhere in the darkness, a wolf called to its pack. But inside the cabin, there was only the crack of burning wood and the soft sound of Sally's breathing as she finally surrendered to exhaustion. The mountain man's scarred face was thoughtful as he watched the flames. He'd spent years building walls around himself, keeping the world at bay with silence and the weight of his reputation. Now, with this unexpected arrival, he felt those walls beginning to crack. Pike and his gang would be back. Men like that always came back. And when they did, they'd find more than a helpless girl waiting for them. As the night deepened, Ephraim remained vigilant. His massive frame was still, but his mind worked like a well-oiled rifle mechanism. He knew every trail these mountains held, every hollow where men might hide. Knowledge bought with years of solitude and bitter experience. Tomorrow would bring its own trials, but for now, his duty was clear. The girl slept peacefully, and he would ensure she remained safe until dawn. The fire burned low, and Ephraim added another log with careful quiet. Sally stirred but didn't wake, her face finally relaxed in sleep. Looking at her, the mountain man felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. Whatever came next, he knew he'd chosen his path when he opened that door to her desperate knocking. In the corner, his rifle gleamed dully in the firelight. Outside, the storm grew fiercer, but within the cabin's walls, a fragile peace held. Ephraim settled deeper into his chair, his weathered hands steady on the rifle's stock, and prepared for the long watch until morning. Snow continued to fall, covering the tracks that led to his door, but Ephraim knew the morning would bring decisions that couldn't be buried so easily. For now, though, he was content to guard this small sanctuary, where a feared man and a wounded soul had found an unexpected moment of grace in the wilderness. The wolves called again, closer now, but their howls held no threat for those within. Ephraim's eyes never left the door, his expression set in lines of quiet determination. Whatever destiny had brought Sally Brookfield to his cabin, he would see it through. The mountain man who'd turned his back on the world found himself, against all expectation, drawn back into its struggles. But this time, he faced them not with violence born of bitterness, but with the strength that comes from protecting another's vulnerability. The night deepened toward dawn, and still Ephraim kept his vigil. In the bed, Sally slept on, safe under the buffalo robe, while outside, the Colorado winter raged against the cabin's sturdy walls. Inside, warmth and shelter held, as simple human kindness proved stronger than the storm's fury or man's cruelty. The storm unleashed its fury against the cabin, walls, making the timbers groan. Inside, Sally huddled closer to the fire, the buffalo robe wrapped tight around her shoulders. The flames cast dancing shadows across her face, highlighting the tracks of dried tears on her cheeks. Ephraim sat in his chair, his presence as solid and unchanging as the mountains themselves. "I reckon I should explain," Sally began, her voice barely above a whisper. The words seemed to catch in her throat, but she forced them out. "Those men, they didn't just take my clothes and dignity." Ephraim's eyes stayed on her face, patient and steady. His silence encouraged her to continue, though speaking of it made her hands tremble anew. "Pa kept the deed papers with him always, but he's been down with fever this past week." Sally's fingers twisted in the edge of the buffalo robe. "Ma needed supplies from town, but she couldn't leave him. I volunteered to make the trip." A bitter laugh escaped her. "Thought I was being helpful, taking the papers to file them proper with the county clerk." The wind howled outside, and Sally flinched at the sound. Ephraim rose silently, moving to add another log to the fire. The fresh wood sparked and crackled, sending a wave of warmth through the cabin. Pike and his men, they knew exactly what they were after. Sally's voice grew stronger with anger. "They stopped my wagon, pretending to ask directions. Then they saw the strongbox under the seat. Pike said something about teaching the stubborn Brookfields a lesson." Ephraim's massive hands tightened on the poker, but his face remained impassive as he stirred the coals. "That stream on our land," Sally continued, "it's the only reliable water source for miles. The railroad wants it for their depot plans. Been trying to buy us out these past 2 years." She looked up at Ephraim, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Without those papers proving our water rights, we've got nothing to stop them taking everything." A log shifted in the fire, sending up a shower of sparks. Ephraim returned to his chair, its wooden frame creaking under his weight. His scarred face was thoughtful as he considered her words. "Them papers," he said finally, his deep voice rough from disuse, "they're the only copy?" Sally nodded miserably. "Pa's lawyer kept one, but his office burned down last month. Strange fire, they said. Nothing left but ashes." She drew a shaky breath. "Without proof of our claim, the railroad's lawyers will take everything. The ranch, the stream, all of it." Ephraim rose again, this time moving to the crude kitchen area. He pulled down a cast-iron pot and some dried meat, working with quiet efficiency. Sally watched him, suddenly aware of the hollow ache in her stomach. She hadn't eaten since breakfast, before everything went wrong. The smell of cooking filled the cabin as Ephraim prepared a simple stew. When he set a bowl before her, Sally hesitated, conscious of her size and the years of mockery she'd endured because of it. Pike's cruel words about her appetite echoed in her memory. "Better shame than starvation," Ephraim grunted, noting her hesitation. His voice held no judgment, only practical wisdom. Eat. Grateful tears pricked Sally's eyes as she took the bowl. The stew was plain but hot, and she couldn't help eating eagerly. Ephraim watched her for a moment, then turned to serve himself. They ate in companionable silence, broken only by the storm's continued assault on the cabin. When Sally finished, she set the empty bowl aside, feeling stronger but also more aware of the desperate situation facing her family. "Why do you live alone up here?" she asked suddenly, then bit her lip, wishing she could take back the too personal question. Ephraim's face closed like a shutter drawn across a window. He rose, taking their bowls to the wash basin, his broad back a wall of silence. Sally watched him, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way his movements became more controlled, as if holding something in check. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I shouldn't have asked." The mountain man continued his task, saying nothing. But Sally saw how his hands moved more carefully now, as if touching something fragile instead of sturdy tin bowls. Exhaustion began to weigh on her, despite the food and warmth. The day's events pressed down like a physical burden, and tears welled up before she could stop them. Pulling the buffalo robe closer, Sally bowed her head. "Lord," she murmured, her voice catching, "please keep Pa and Ma safe. Don't let them worry too much about me, and please—" She faltered, then continued in a whisper, "Please help us find a way to save our home." Ephraim turned from the wash basin, his expression troubled as he watched her pray. Something in her simple faith, her concern for others even in her own distress, seemed to touch something long buried in him. He remembered another time, another prayer spoken in desperation, before violence and blood had driven him to this solitary existence. Sally wiped her eyes with the edge of the robe, trying to master herself. When she looked up, she found Ephraim studying her with an intensity that should have been frightening. But instead of fear, she felt only a strange sense of safety. This man, whom others called dangerous, had shown her nothing but kindness. The wind moaned around the cabin corners, and somewhere in the darkness, a wolf answered. Sally shivered, but not from cold. The weight of her family's predicament pressed down harder than ever. Without those papers, everything her parents had worked for would be lost. Ephraim moved back to his chair, his movements deliberate and controlled. His face remained stern, but there was something different in his eyes now. A softening, as if he recognized in her situation echoes of his own past wounds. He had once faced injustice, too, though his response had led him to this solitary life in the mountains. Now, watching Sally's quiet strength in the face of cruelty and loss, something shifted in him. The girl wasn't a nuisance dropped on his doorstep, but a soul unjustly wronged. Like him, she faced the crushing weight of powerful men who cared nothing for right or wrong, only profit and progress. Sally stifled a yawn, fighting against exhaustion. The warmth of the fire and the full meal made her eyelids heavy, but she feared closing her eyes. Every time she did, she saw Pike's mocking face, felt the cruel hands stripping away her dignity. "Sleep," Ephraim said quietly. "You're safe here." She wanted to protest, to say something about imposing on his kindness, but weariness won out. Curling up in the buffalo robe near the fire, Sally let her eyes close. The last thing she saw was Ephraim's massive form in his chair, steady as a mountain, watching over her rest. The storm continued its assault on the cabin, but inside, a fragile peace held. Ephraim sat motionless, his thoughts turning over Sally's story like stones in a stream. The lost deed, the railroad's greed, a family about to lose everything they'd worked for. It stirred memories he'd rather have left buried. But looking at Sally's sleeping form, Seeing the trust she placed in him, despite his fearsome reputation, Ephraim felt his carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. He'd chosen isolation to escape the world's injustice, but here was injustice seeking him out, wearing the face of a brave young woman who'd suffered but hadn't broken. The fire burned low, needing tending, but Ephraim remained still, troubled by emotions he'd thought long dead. Compassion, anger at cruelty, the stirring of something that felt dangerously like purpose. Outside, the Colorado winter raged on, while inside, two wounded souls found an unexpected moment of sanctuary. The night was far from over, and tomorrow would bring its own trials. But for now, Sally slept peacefully under the buffalo robe, while Ephraim kept his silent vigil, his heart softening despite all his determined efforts to keep it hard. Dawn broke over the Colorado mountains, painting the snow-laden peaks in shades of rose and gold. The storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine blanket of white that sparkled under the clear morning sky. Ephraim Cutter stood in his doorway, surveying the transformed landscape with practiced eyes. Behind him, Sally Brookfield wrapped herself more tightly in the oversized shirt he'd given her. The rough cotton hung nearly to her knees, a far cry from her proper dress, but it was clean and warm. She watched as Ephraim strode through the knee-deep snow toward his woodpile, his broad shoulders rolling with each step. The sharp crack of the axe splitting wood echoed across the mountain clearing. Sally hesitated only a moment before stepping out into the brightness. The snow crunched beneath her borrowed boots as she made her way toward the edge of the clearing where fallen branches lay half-buried. "Reckon we'll need kindling," she called out, her voice carrying in the crisp morning air. Ephraim paused mid-swing, watching her. He gave a single nod before returning to his task, the axe rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Sally gathered the smaller branches, grateful for the work to keep her mind off yesterday's terror. Her feet, still tender from her barefoot flight through the snow, protested with each step. A particularly deep drift caught her by surprise, and she stumbled forward with a startled cry. Before she could fall, a strong hand gripped her elbow, steadying her. Ephraim had moved with surprising speed for such a big man. He said nothing, just made sure she was stable before returning to his woodpile. But the moment stayed with Sally, that gentle strength, so at odds with the fearsome stories she'd heard about him. "They say," she began, then faltered as he turned to look at her. Drawing courage from the morning light, she continued. "They say you killed 2 men in Miller's Crossing, in the saloon." The axe bit deep into a log, and Ephraim left it there, embedded in the wood. His scarred face was unreadable as he studied her. 3, he said finally, his voice low and rough. "They don't tell it right." Sally clutched her bundle of kindling closer. "I reckon most stories aren't told right," she said softly. "Folks see what they expect to see." Something flickered in Ephraim's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. He pulled the axe free and split another log with controlled force. "And what do you see?" "A man who opened his door to someone in need," Sally answered honestly, "who gave shelter and food without asking anything in return. That's not the monster they whisper about in town." Ephraim's shoulders tensed, but he didn't respond. Instead, he gathered an armload of split wood and carried it towards the cabin. Sally followed with her kindling, noting how the morning light caught the silver threading through his dark hair. A wicker from the lean-to shelter drew her attention. A massive sorrel gelding stood there, its coat gleaming copper in the sun. Ephraim set down his wood and moved to tend the horse, his movements easier now, more natural. "He's beautiful," Sally said, admiring the animal's strong lines. "Name's Chief," Ephraim replied, measuring out grain. Good horse. Sure-footed in the mountains." He paused, running a hand down the gelding's nose. "If we're heading to town, you should know. Folk won't take kindly to seeing you with me." Sally's heart leapt at his words. "Then you'll help me? Help me find the men who took the deed?" Ephraim turned to face her, his expression grave. "Town's changed since I was there last. Railroads brought new faces, new trouble." He studied her face. "You sure about this?" "I have to be," Sally said firmly. "That deed is everything to my family. Without it—" She trailed off, unable to voice the fear of losing their ranch, their home. Ephraim nodded slowly. "Need to check my rifle first. Restock powder." He moved past her into the cabin, emerging moments later, with an old Hawken rifle. The weapon looked well used but cared for, like everything else in his careful domain. Sally busied herself building up the fire while Ephraim cleaned his rifle. The familiar tasks helped settle her nerves, though her hands shook slightly as she arranged the kindling. The magnitude of what lay ahead, confronting Pike and his men, possibly facing violence, pressed heavily on her mind. As evening approached, the cabin grew dim except for the firelight. Sally found herself humming softly as she helped prepare their simple supper. The tune became words, almost without her thinking about it, her clear voice lifting in an old hymn she'd learned at her mother's knee. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me." The familiar words filled the cabin with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. But when she glanced at Ephraim, she saw him turn sharply away, his hands stilling on the rifle. Something in the hymn had struck a chord, perhaps stirred memories he'd rather leave undisturbed. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to." "My mother," he cut in, his voice rough. "She used to sing that. Sunday mornings, working in her garden." He set the rifle down with careful precision. "Long time ago?" Sally watched him move to the window, his broad frame silhouetted against the darkening sky. She saw in that moment not the fearsome mountain man of legend, but someone marked by loss, by choices that had driven him to this solitary life. "We'll leave at first light," he said, still facing the window. "Town's a day's ride if the weather holds." He turned back to her, his face shadowed. "Get some rest. Tomorrow won't be easy." Sally nodded, settling near the fire with the buffalo robe. Her last sight before sleep claimed her was Ephraim returning to his rifle, his movements measured and deliberate as he prepared for whatever challenges the morning might bring. Outside, an owl called into the gathering night, its cry echoing across the snow-covered mountains. Inside the cabin, two unlikely allies prepared for a journey that would test them both, the scorned young woman and the feared mountain man, bound together by circumstance and a growing understanding of shared wounds. The fire crackled low, casting dancing shadows on the walls as Ephraim completed his preparations. Tomorrow they would ride for town, facing whatever consequences came from their strange partnership. But for now, in the quiet of the mountain night, they had found a moment of peace in their shared vigil. Dawn painted the mountains in shades of rose and gold as Ephraim led his sorrel gelding from the lean-to shelter. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air while he worked, methodically checking each strap and buckle of the saddle. Sally stood in the cabin doorway, wearing the warmest clothes he could spare, a wool shirt beneath his old buckskin coat, both hanging loose on her frame. "Snow's too deep for you to ride. Your own mount," he said, his voice carrying in the still morning air. "Even if we had one?" He moved to the side of the cabin where he'd worked the previous evening, dragging forth a crude sled he'd fashioned from rough-hewn pine boards. "This'll have to do." Sally studied the makeshift conveyance, noting the rope bindings and runner rails smoothed to slide over snow. You made this last night?" Ephraim nodded, securing the sled's lead rope to his saddle horn. "Ain't pretty, but it'll get you down the mountain." He tested the knots one final time before turning to her. "Best get moving. Days are short this time of year." The sun had barely cleared the eastern peaks when they set out. Ephraim led Chief carefully along the snow-packed trail, the sled sliding smoothly in their wake. Sally sat wrapped in the buffalo robe, watching the wilderness unfold around them. Ancient pines stood sentinel along their path, their branches heavy with snow. Here and there, fallen logs created natural bridges over frozen creeks, their surfaces gleaming like polished glass. The morning passed in relative silence, broken only by the crunch of hooves in snow and the soft scraping of the sled runners. Around mid-morning, Sally noticed tracks crossing their path, large, distinct paw prints in the fresh powder. "Wolves," Ephraim confirmed without her asking. "Pack moved through here before dawn." He adjusted his rifle in its scabbard, keeping it close at hand. "They usually avoid folks, but winter makes them bold." Sally pulled the buffalo robe tighter, trying to hide her shiver. "You seem to know these mountains well. Better than most?" Ephraim guided Chief around a fallen tree. "Been up here 15 years, give or take, long enough to learn respect for what the land can do." They continued their slow descent, the trail winding between towering rock faces and through stands of aspen. Sally found herself studying her silent companion, noting how he read the terrain with practiced ease, choosing the safest path for horse and sled. "May I ask you something?" she ventured after another long stretch of silence. Ephraim glanced back at her, then returned his attention to the trail. "Reckon you just did. Why do people fear you so?" The question had been burning in her mind since the previous day. "In town they speak your name in whispers, even my father." Ephraim was quiet for so long, she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost lost in the mountain wind. 5 years back, railroad sent men to clear out some homesteaders, family named Martinez. Good people. Had their papers all proper, but railroad wanted their water rights. He paused, adjusting the reins in his gloved hands. Enforcers came at night, set fire to their barn, would have burned the house too with the children inside. Sally leaned forward, transfixed by the story. "What happened?" "I happened." His words carried a weight of memory. "Was staying in their root cellar, that winter, helping with repairs. Came up through the kitchen floor when I heard the screaming." He was quiet again, lost in recollection. "Left 2 men bleeding in the snow. Third one ran. Railroad blamed me for their deaths, put a price on my head for a while. Didn't matter that I was protecting innocent folks. People heard killer and made up their minds." The admission sent a chill through Sally that had nothing to do with the cold. Yet mixed with her fear was a growing understanding and respect. "You protected them, the children. Did what needed doing." His tone made it clear he considered the subject closed. By midday, they reached an abandoned line shack, little more than 4 walls and a roof, but shelter from the biting wind. Ephraim helped Sally from the sled, his hands strong and sure as he steadied her. Inside, dust covered everything, but the rough-hewn table and bench were solid enough. Ephraim dug in his saddlebags, producing jerky and a battered coffee pot. Soon, the bitter aroma of brewing coffee filled the small space. Sally accepted the cup he offered, warming her hands around the tin. "Thank you," she said softly. "Not just for this, for treating me like a person, with dignity." Her voice caught slightly. "Those men, the ones who took the deed, they laughed, made sport of me, said no one would believe someone like me anyway." Ephraim's scarred face hardened at her words. He stared into his coffee cup as if it held answers. "Men like that," he said finally, "they're cowards at heart. Need to hurt others to feel strong." He met her eyes across the table. "Don't make their cruelty your shame." Sally blinked back sudden tears, touched by the gruff kindness in his words. She saw Ephraim shift uncomfortably, unused to such emotion, but his words had lifted a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. They resumed their journey as afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow. The trail grew steeper, requiring all of Chief's sure-footed strength to navigate. Sally watched Ephraim constantly checking their surroundings, alert for any sign of danger. As dusk approached, he led them into a grove of massive pines. The trees provided natural shelter, their branches creating a cathedral-like space beneath. "We'll camp here," he announced, helping Sally from the sled. "Too dangerous to travel these trails after dark." While Sally gathered pine needles for bedding, Ephraim built a fire larger than strictly needed for warmth. "Wolves," he explained simply, adding another log to the flames. "Fire'll keep them back." The night settled around them like a heavy blanket, stars appearing one by one through the pine boughs overhead. Sally sat close to the fire, the buffalo robe wrapped around her shoulders, while Ephraim moved quietly through their camp, checking the horse and securing their supplies. In the distance, a wolf howled, a long, mournful sound that echoed off the mountainsides. Another answered, closer, making Sally start. Ephraim silently added more wood to the fire, the flames leaping higher, pushing back the darkness. "Try to rest," he said, settling on the other side of the fire with his rifle across his knees. "I'll keep watch." Sally studied him through the dancing flames, this feared mountain man who had shown her more kindness than she'd known in years. The firelight softened his scars, revealing the person beneath the fearsome reputation. She saw how the weight of past violence sat heavy on his shoulders, yet he had chosen to help her, to risk returning to a town that branded him a killer. The wolves called again, their voices twining together in the night, but Sally found she was no longer afraid. She lay down on the pine needle bed, watching Ephraim's steady presence through half-closed eyes. His figure remained vigilant, a guardian between her and the darkness, as the fire crackled and the stars wheeled overhead. The mountain night deepened around them, filled with the whisper of wind through pine boughs and the occasional distant cry of a wolf. But within their circle of firelight, an unlikely trust had begun to grow, born of shared hardship and unexpected kindness, strengthening with each mile of their journey together. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered valley as Ephraim and Sally approached the town of Pine Creek. Wooden buildings huddled together against the cold, smoke rising from chimneys in thin gray ribbons against the pale winter sky. Sally sat straighter in the sled, squaring her shoulders despite her borrowed clothes and the buffalo robe wrapped around her substantial frame. "You don't have to come in with me," Ephraim said gruffly, reining Chief to a stop at the town's edge. "Could wait here?" Sally shook her head firmly. "I won't hide. These are my people, even if some treat me poorly." Her voice trembled slightly but held determination. "Besides, I need to show those drifters they didn't break me." Ephraim studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Without another word, he clicked to Chief, and they continued down the main street. The horses' hooves and sled runners made soft crunching sounds in the packed snow. Their arrival did not go unnoticed. Faces appeared in frost-etched windows, and people stopped in their tracks on the wooden sidewalks. The whispers started immediately, carrying clearly in the cold air. "Lord above, is that the cutter? Coming down from his mountain cave. And look who he's brought with him, Brookfield's fat girl." Sally's cheeks flamed red, but she kept her chin up, even as more townsfolk emerged from shops to stare. A group of children pointed and giggled until their mother hurriedly shooed them inside. Ephraim's massive presence beside her seemed to grow more intimidating with each step, his scarred face set in stern lines that discouraged direct mockery. They stopped first at Willard's general store. The bell above the door jangled as they entered, and old Mr. Willard looked up from his ledger. His eyes widened at the sight of Ephraim's imposing figure, then narrowed when he recognized Sally. "Miss Brookfield," he said, his tone cool. "Heard you had some trouble up the mountain way." "Yes, sir," Sally replied evenly. "I need some supplies, clothes mainly, and basic provisions. We'll settle up on credit as usual." Willard's thin lips pressed together. "Can't do that, miss. Your father's account is already too far in arrears. Unless you've got cash money." "Now see here," Sally started, her voice rising with indignation. "We've always made good on our debts, even if sometimes slow. You know my father." A heavy thud cut her off. Ephraim had slammed several silver coins onto the counter. They gleamed in the pale light filtering through the store's windows. His massive hand remained planted beside them as he fixed Willard with an unblinking stare. "The lady needs supplies," he said quietly. The words carried clearly in the tense silence. Willard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Yes, of course." He hurriedly gathered the coins. "What items did you require, Miss Brookfield?" Sally listed her needs while Ephraim stood like a mountain at her back. She selected a simple dress, warm stockings, and sturdy boots to replace what the drifters had stolen. Willard's hands shook slightly as he wrapped each item in brown paper, tied with string. As they left the store, Sally whispered, "Thank you. You didn't have to do that." "Needed doing," Ephraim replied simply. He loaded the packages into the sled, then helped Sally down from Chief's back. "Best get some hot food in you. Been a long day." The boarding house sat at the end of the street, its windows glowing with warmth and lamplight. The smell of cooking drew them in, beef stew and fresh bread. Mrs. Henderson, the owner, greeted them at the door with only a slight widening of her eyes at their odd pairing. "Sarah Jane Brookfield, you poor dear," she clucked, ushering them inside. "Heard about your trouble. Come in. And you too, Mr. Cutter." She led them to a table near the crackling hearth. "We've got plenty of stew tonight." Sally was grateful for the older woman's kind manner, but as she settled into her chair, movement in the corner caught her eye. Her heart lurched painfully in her chest. There, hunched over their own bowls of stew, sat 3 men she recognized instantly, the drifters who had robbed and humiliated her. They hadn't noticed her yet, too involved in their own low conversation and food. Sally's hands began to shake. She half rose from her chair, anger and fear warring in her chest. Ephraim's hand closed gently but firmly around her arm. "Not yet," he murmured, pulling her back down. "They'll face justice, but not here. Not now." "They have my father's deed," Sally whispered back fiercely. "Every moment we wait is a moment to plan proper," Ephraim cut in. His voice was soft, but carried iron beneath it. "Rushing in gets people killed. Trust me on this." Sally subsided, though her heart still raced. Mrs. Henderson brought their stew, and Sally forced herself to eat slowly, not looking directly at the corner where the drifters sat. She could feel Ephraim's steady presence beside her, his broad shoulders between her and any threat. After what felt like hours, the drifters finally stood and left, never noticing Sally in the shadows by the hearth. Only when their boots had stopped creaking on the porch outside did she let out a shaky breath. Mrs. Henderson showed them to their rooms upstairs, separate chambers with a shared hallway between. The rooms were small but clean, each with a narrow bed and washstand. Sally changed into her new nightdress behind a screen, grateful to be out of Ephraim's borrowed clothes. When she knelt beside her bed to pray, the floorboards in the hall creaked. Through the partially open door, she could see Ephraim standing there, his massive frame filling the doorway. His expression was troubled as he watched her bow her head. "Dear Lord," Sally whispered, hands clasped tight. "Grant me courage for what's to come. Help me face those men with strength, not fear, and—" She paused, voice softening. "Watch over Mr. Cutter, who's shown such unexpected kindness to one in need. Amen." When she looked up, Ephraim had gone, but she could hear him pacing in his room next door. The sound was oddly comforting as she climbed into bed, pulling the quilts up to her chin. Outside her window, snow began to fall again, adding another layer of white to the sleeping town. Sally lay awake for a long time, listening to Ephraim's heavy footsteps and thinking of the drifters so near at hand. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now she felt safer than she had since the attack. She drifted off to sleep with a prayer of thanks on her lips, grateful for the protective presence in the next room. Morning sunlight glinted off fresh snow as Sally and Ephraim made their way to the sheriff's office. The wooden building sat squat and official on the corner of Main Street, its windows reflecting the bright winter day. Sally's new boots crunched in the snow, and she drew her borrowed shawl tighter against the chill. Ephraim's presence beside her was like a shadow, massive and protective. His scarred face was set in grim lines as they climbed the weathered steps to the sheriff's door. The wood creaked beneath his weight. Sheriff Harlan Yance looked up from his desk as they entered, his broad shoulders filling out his tan shirt. A tin star gleamed on his chest. His eyes, quick and calculating, took in Sally's borrowed clothes and Ephraim's looming figure. "Well now," he drawled, leaning back in his chair. "What brings the mountain man to town? And with Miss Brookfield, no less." His tone was pleasant enough, but something cold lurked beneath it. Sally stepped forward, hands clasped tight. "Sheriff, I need to report a theft. 3 days ago, some drifters robbed me on the mountain road. They took our deed papers, proof of our water rights." Yance's expression didn't change, but his fingers drummed once on his desk. "That's so? Mighty unfortunate. These drifters, you can describe them?" "Yes, sir." Sally's voice grew stronger. 3 men. The leader was tall and thin, with a scar on his chin. Called himself Jed Pike. The others were shorter, one with red hair, one missing 2 fingers on his left hand. She swallowed hard. They hurt me, Sheriff. Took everything I had and left me to freeze." Ephraim's shadow seemed to deepen behind her. The sheriff's eyes flicked to him, then back to Sally. "Hard business," Yance said, shrugging, "but hard to prove without the deed itself. Drifters come and go. Might be halfway to Kansas by now." "But I saw them just last night," Sally protested. "In the boarding house. They're still here in town." The sheriff spread his hands. "Your word against theirs, miss. And about that deed?" He pulled out a folder, thumbing through papers. "Railroad's got a prior claim filed on those water rights. Seems to me this might be a blessing in disguise. Save your pa the trouble of a court fight he'd likely lose." Sally felt the blood drain from her face. Beside her, Ephraim's massive frame went rigid. "That claim's false," she said, voice shaking. "We've worked that land 15 years. The stream runs through our property." "Now, Miss Brookfield," Yance cut in smoothly. "Let's not get excited. Way I see it, you've had a rough time. Best go home, talk to your pa about accepting the railroad's offer while it stands." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Unless you've got that deed to prove otherwise?" Ephraim's hand landed heavy on Sally's shoulder. "Much obliged for your time, Sheriff," he rumbled, the words forced through clenched teeth. He steered Sally toward the door. "Always glad to help," Yance called after them. "And Cutter, watch yourself in my town." Outside, Sally's legs trembled. She grabbed the porch railing, breathing hard. "He knows," she whispered. "He's working with them, with the railroad." Ephraim spat into the snow. "Law in town's bought and paid for," he growled. "Same as it was when they came for the Jensen place." His scarred face was dark with old memories. "We'll get that deed back ourselves." Sally straightened her spine. "How? Those men are dangerous." "So am I." Ephraim's voice was flat. "But first we need a record. Someone official, someone honest to write down everything you remember about that deed." Hope flickered in Sally's chest. "Reverend Miles," she said. "He's always stood for what's right, no matter who it angers." They waited until evening to visit the church parsonage, not wanting to draw more attention. The small house glowed with lamplight, smoke curling from its chimney into the purple dusk. Sally's knock was answered by Reverend Josiah Miles himself. His kind face creased with concern when he saw them. "Sarah Jane Brookfield," he said warmly, "and Mr. Cutter, this is unexpected." He ushered them inside, out of the gathering cold. "What brings you to my door at this hour?" The parsonage was warm and smelled of coffee and leather-bound books. Sally sank gratefully into an offered chair while Ephraim remained standing, too large for the delicate furniture. The Reverend listened intently as Sally explained their situation, his expression growing grave. "This is troubling news indeed," he said when she finished. "The railroad's influence grows stronger every month, but God's truth must prevail." He went to his desk and took out paper and ink. "Tell me everything you remember about that deed, child. Every detail, every term and condition." Sally closed her eyes, picturing the document she'd seen her father read so many times. "It was dated 1859, she began, signed by Territory Agent William Morrison. It granted water rights to the North Fork of Bear Creek, from the springhead down to the valley floor." For nearly an hour, she recited every detail she could remember, while Reverend Miles's pen scratched across the paper. He asked careful questions, drawing out information she didn't know she recalled. When she finished, he sanded the ink dry and sealed the papers in an envelope. "I'll keep this safe," he promised, storing it in his desk drawer. "A sworn testimony might not carry the weight of the original deed, but it's something. And I'll speak to Judge Harrison when he comes through next month. He's an honest man." Sally felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you, Reverend. You don't know what this means." "I think I do," he said softly. His gaze moved to Ephraim, who stood silent in the lamplight. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, bringing help from unexpected quarters." Ephraim shifted uncomfortably, but something in his stern face had softened. The lamplight caught his scars differently now, making them seem less fearsome. Sally watched as he awkwardly touched the brim of his hat to the Reverend. "Much obliged," Ephraim muttered. Outside, the night had grown deeper. Stars pricked the black sky above the silent town. Sally breathed in the crisp air, feeling lighter despite everything. They had a plan now, and an ally in the Reverend. More than that, she had Ephraim beside her, this feared man who had become her unexpected protector. They walked back toward the boarding house in comfortable silence. The snow squeaked beneath their boots, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. Sally glanced at Ephraim's profile, stark against the starlit snow. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for believing me, for helping." He grunted softly. "Ain't right what they're doing. To you or your pa." His voice was rough but gentle. Sometimes a man's got to stand against wrong, no matter the cost. Sally nodded, understanding that he spoke from hard experience. In the peaceful night, with hope rekindled in her heart, she sent up a silent prayer of gratitude for this strange twist of fate that had brought Ephraim Cutter into her life. The boarding house windows glowed ahead of them, promising warmth and rest. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, Sally felt almost at peace. Even Ephraim's usual tension seemed to have eased somewhat, as if the Reverend's quiet faith had touched something long buried in his hardened heart. Mrs. Henderson had left a lamp burning in the hallway for them. They climbed the stairs in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the day's events and what was yet to come. Dawn painted the eastern sky in pale gold as Ephraim and Sally prepared to leave the boarding house. They had risen before anyone else, hoping to avoid notice. The morning air bit sharp and cold, their breath forming clouds in the dim light. Ephraim checked his rifle one final time, the metal clicking softly in his practiced hands. Sally wrapped herself in the warm coat he'd bought her at the general store, her eyes fixed on the hills where they'd spotted the drifters heading yesterday afternoon. "You sure about this?" Ephraim asked gruffly. "Could be dangerous." Sally nodded, squaring her shoulders. "That deed means everything to my family. I won't let fear stop me from trying to save our land." They led their horses quietly through the sleeping town, boots crunching in the fresh snow. Once past the last buildings, Ephraim helped Sally mount, his huge hands steady and respectful at her waist. The sun was just cresting the mountains when they picked up the drifter's trail. "4 men," Ephraim muttered, studying the tracks. Headed northwest, toward the old mining claims. His scarred face was grim in the morning light. "They're moving slow, probably drinking heavy last night." They followed the tracks through stands of pine and bare aspen, climbing steadily into the foothills. Sally marveled at how easily Ephraim read the signs. A broken twig here, a scuffed rock there. The big man moved with surprising grace despite his size, leading them surely along the drifter's path. Around mid-morning, Ephraim raised his hand for silence. They dismounted, leaving the horses ground-tied in a grove of trees. Creeping forward, they found a vantage point overlooking a small valley. Below, smoke rose from a campfire near the mouth of an abandoned mine shaft. "There," Sally whispered, pointing. She recognized Jed Pike's lanky form slouched by the fire. The other 3 men sprawled nearby, passing a bottle between them. Her heart pounded at the sight of her tormentors, but she forced herself to stay calm. Ephraim's hand tightened on his rifle. "I count 4 guns. 2 by the fire, 1 in that lean-to, 1 keeping watch." His voice was cold. "Won't be hard to take them." "Take them?" Sally touched his arm. "You mean kill them? They left you to die in the snow." The muscles in his jaw worked. "Men like that don't deserve mercy." "No." Sally's voice was firm despite her fear. "Vengeance won't restore the deed. It'll just bring more bloodshed, more pain." She met his hard gaze. "There has to be a better way." Ephraim studied her face for a long moment. Finally, he gave a slight nod. "We'll wait till dark. Watch their routine. Find our moment." They spent the day observing the camp from their hidden position. The drifters seemed content to drink and gamble, arguing occasionally over their cards. Pike kept the leather pouch containing Sally's deed close by his bedroll. The watch changed every few hours, but the men grew increasingly careless as the whiskey flowed. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped sharply. 2 of the men had passed out near the fire, while Pike dozed in the lean-to. Only the current watchman remained alert, though he huddled miserably against the cold. "Now's our chance," Ephraim whispered. He laid out his plan, and Sally nodded her agreement. Moving silently through the shadows, Ephraim circled behind the sleeping men. Sally waited until he was in position, then stepped into the firelight, letting tears flow freely down her cheeks. "Please," she called out, startling the watchman. "Please help me. I'm lost." The man stared at her, confused by her sudden appearance. "Hey, ain't you that Brookfield girl?" "I got separated from my pa," Sally continued, moving closer. "Been wandering all day?" She stumbled deliberately, drawing the man's attention. Behind him, Ephraim rose like a shadow. The rifle butt struck precisely, and the watchman crumpled without a sound. In the same fluid motion, Ephraim dealt with the two drunks by the fire, leaving them senseless but breathing. Sally hurried to Pike's lean-to, while Ephraim secured the unconscious men with rope from their own supplies. The leather pouch lay within arm's reach of the sleeping outlaw. Heart hammering, she carefully extracted it from beside him. A twig snapped under her foot as she backed away. Pike's eyes flew open. "What the—" He reached for his gun, but Ephraim was already there. The huge mountain man lifted Pike by his shirt front, disarming him with casual strength. "Evening," Ephraim growled. "Remember this lady?" Pike's eyes darted between them, widening with recognition and fear. "Now hold on," he stammered. "We was just having some fun. No harm meant—" "No harm?" Sally's voice shook with anger. "You stripped me naked and left me to freeze." Ephraim's face darkened. His free hand clenched into a fist. "Don't." Sally touched his arm again. "Don't let blood stain this blessing. We have what we came for." The moment stretched taut as a bowstring. Then Ephraim's shoulders relaxed slightly. He slammed Pike against a tree and bound him securely. "You're right," he told Sally quietly. "Killing them won't undo what they did." He checked the ropes one final time. The cold might teach them something about mercy, though. They gathered their horses and rode away from the camp, leaving the drifters bound but alive. The stars wheeled bright and cold overhead, and Sally clutched the precious deed papers to her chest. "Thank you," she said softly. "Not just for helping me, but for choosing mercy. I know how hard that was." Ephraim rode silently for several minutes before responding. "There's been too much death in my life," he said at last. "Maybe it's time to try a different path." They continued through the night, putting distance between themselves and the drifters' camp. Sally watched Ephraim's broad back as he led the way, wondering at the changes she saw in this feared man who had become her protector. His scars seemed less fearsome now, marks of a past he was choosing to move beyond. The deed papers rustled against her chest, a tangible reminder of their victory. But the greater triumph, she thought, lay in the way they had won it, not through violence, but through wisdom and restraint. In sparing those men's lives, Ephraim had taken his first step toward redemption. Dawn was breaking again when they finally stopped to rest. Sally watched the sun rise, painting the snow-covered peaks in rose and gold. Beside her, Ephraim built a small fire and brewed coffee, his movements sure and steady in the growing light. The morning felt full of promise, like a new chapter opening before them. They had recovered the deed, saved her family's land, and done it without adding more bloodshed to the ledger. As Sally sipped her coffee, she offered up a silent prayer of gratitude for the strange turns of fate that had brought her to this moment and to this man. The journey back to town seemed lighter somehow, despite their weariness. Sally kept one hand pressed against her coat pocket, reassuring herself that the deed was still there, safe and recovered. Ephraim rode beside her now rather than ahead, his massive form a steady presence in the morning light. As they approached the town limits, Sally straightened her spine. "I won't skulk in like someone ashamed," she declared. "We did nothing wrong. We made things right." Ephraim nodded, a ghost of approval crossing his weathered features. The clip-clop of their horses' hooves on the packed snow drew attention as they made their way down Main Street. Townsfolk paused in their morning routines, watching the unlikely pair with undisguised curiosity. "Look there," someone whispered. "The mountain man and the Brookfield girl." This time the whispers held a different note, less mockery, more wonderment. Sally held her head high, and even Ephraim seemed to sit taller in his saddle. They had faced danger together and emerged victorious. The sideways glances couldn't touch them now. They dismounted in front of the church, where morning sunlight sparkled on fresh snow. Sally's boots crunched as she hurried up the wooden steps, Ephraim following more slowly, his spurs jingling quietly. Inside, the church was warm and peaceful, smelling of pine boughs and lamp oil. Reverend Miles looked up from his desk, his kind face breaking into a smile. "Welcome back. I've been praying for your safe return." Sally pulled the leather pouch from her coat. "We found it, Reverend. The deed. It's all here." Her hands trembled slightly as she passed it over. The preacher carefully examined the documents, nodding with satisfaction. "Every page accounted for. Praise be." He looked up at Ephraim, who hung back near the door. "You've done a good thing here, Mr. Cutter." Ephraim shifted uncomfortably, unused to praise. Was her idea, her courage. Nevertheless, Reverend Miles crossed to the heavy iron lockbox built into the church wall. "This will stay safe here until we can file it properly with the land office." The key turned with a solid click that seemed to echo with finality. Sally felt tears of relief spring to her eyes. "Thank you, Reverend, for everything." "Your father will be proud, child." The preacher squeezed her shoulder. "Both of what you recovered, and how you went about it." As they stepped back outside, Sally noticed Ephraim looking around the town square with new eyes. His usual wariness seemed tempered by something else, a cautious openness, perhaps. Several townspeople nodded greeting to them, and though Ephraim didn't exactly smile, his customary scowl was absent. "Feels different," he muttered, almost to himself. "Being here in daylight, with purpose?" Sally understood. She'd seen how he lived up in his mountain cabin, cut off from human contact. "A man's not meant to be alone forever," she said softly. They spent the afternoon seeing to practical matters, fresh supplies, horse feed, repairs to their winter gear. To Sally's surprise, Ephraim didn't immediately speak of returning to his solitude. Instead, he agreed to join her for supper at the boarding house. The dining room was crowded that evening, filled with the clatter of plates and the hum of conversation. Heads turned as Sally and Ephraim entered, but she no longer felt the need to shrink from the attention. They found seats at a corner table, where the landlady served them generous portions of beef stew and fresh bread. About halfway through the meal, Sally felt a familiar stirring in her heart. The hymn rose naturally to her lips, soft at first, then growing stronger. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me." The dining room gradually fell silent as her clear voice filled the space. Sally kept her eyes closed, letting the familiar words carry her. She thought of her father's teachings, about faith being a light in dark places, about mercy triumphing over judgment. "I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see." When she opened her eyes, she found the room utterly still. Several women were wiping tears. Even the usually boisterous cattle drivers by the window sat respectfully quiet. But it was Ephraim's expression that caught and held her attention. The big man's face had softened, the hard lines of pain and isolation smoothed away. His eyes held a faraway look, and Sally could almost see the memories playing across his features, perhaps of a mother's voice, a childhood faith, a time before violence and solitude had claimed him. The spell held for several heartbeats after the last note faded. Then someone started to clap, and others joined in. Sally blushed, unused to approval from these people who had so often mocked her. But it was honest appreciation she saw in their faces now, not derision. "Didn't know we had such a voice in town," the landlady said, patting Sally's shoulder as she cleared their plates. "You must sing for us again sometime, dear." Later, they stepped out into the crisp night air. Fresh snow was falling, big lazy flakes that drifted down in the lamplight. They walked slowly through the quiet streets, their boots leaving parallel tracks in the new powder. "Your voice," Ephraim said suddenly, breaking a long silence. "It could soften stone." His words formed white puffs in the cold air. Sally felt warmth bloom in her chest despite the winter chill. She looked up at him. This feared mountain man who had shown her such unexpected gentleness, who had chosen mercy over violence for her sake. The lamplight softened his scars, and she saw him clearly, not as the townsfolk's whispered legends painted him, but as he truly was. A man wounded but not broken, capable of change and growth, and perhaps even tenderness. "Thank you," she said softly, knowing he meant more than just the simple compliment. "For everything." They walked on through the falling snow, close but not quite touching. Something new and fragile was growing between them, a cautious hope, a tentative reaching toward possibility. Sally felt it in the way Ephraim walked beside her rather than ahead, in how his gruff manner had gentled, in the way his presence made her feel not afraid, but protected, valued, seen. The town slept around them, transformed by snow into something clean and new. Like their own hearts, Sally thought, where grace had begun its quiet work of renewal. Whatever tomorrow might bring, this moment held its own kind of perfection. Two lonely souls finding, against all odds, that faith and friendship could light even the darkest path. As they reached the boarding house porch, the church bell tolled the hour, its deep notes rolling out across the snow-hushed streets. Sally paused with her hand on the door, reluctant to end this moment. Ephraim stood quietly, his broad shoulders dusted with snow, looking more at peace than she had ever seen him. In the morning, there would be practical matters to attend to, filing the deed, informing her father, deciding what came next. But for now, this was enough. The snow falling softly around them, the warmth of newfound understanding between them, and the first stirrings of something that felt very much like hope. The morning dawned bright and cold, frost patterns etching the boarding house windows. Sally had woken early, eager to begin the journey back to her family's ranch. She packed her few belongings while humming the hymn from the night before, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. Through the window, she watched Ephraim checking his horse in the livery stable across the street, his broad figure moving with purpose in the early light. The sound of boots on wooden planks drew her attention. A group of men strode purposefully down the street, Sheriff Yance and 3 deputies, their badges glinting in the morning sun. Sally's breath caught as they approached Ephraim, who straightened slowly from adjusting his saddle. "Ephraim Cutter?" Sheriff Yance called out, his voice carrying across the quiet street. "You're under arrest." Sally grabbed her shawl and rushed down the boarding house stairs, bursting out into the bitter morning air. By the time she reached the stable, 2 deputies had already seized Ephraim's arms. His face was stone, but his eyes blazed with contained fury. "What is the meaning of this?" Sally demanded, her voice shaking with anger and fear. Sheriff Yance turned to her with a practiced look of regret that didn't reach his eyes. "Assault and theft, Miss Brookfield. Got 3 witnesses saying your friend here attacked those peaceful travelers' camps up in the hills, beat them senseless and robbed them." "That's a lie." Sally's voice rose sharply. "Those men robbed me first. They stole my father's deed. We only took back what was rightfully ours." "So you admit there was violence and theft involved?" The sheriff's smirk widened as he produced a folded paper from his vest. "This warrant says different about who wronged who. And that deed you mention, well, that's evidence now." He gestured to his 3rd deputy, who stepped forward and pulled the leather pouch from Ephraim's saddlebag. Sally watched in horror as Sheriff Yance tucked it into his coat. "You can't do this," she whispered, but her voice strengthened as anger overcame fear. "Those men attacked me. They left me to freeze in the snow. Ephraim saved my life." A small crowd had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Sally felt their stares, some curious, some pitying, some barely concealing their satisfaction at seeing the feared mountain man brought low. Her cheeks burned, but she held her head high. "Justice favors order, Miss Brookfield," Sheriff Yance said smoothly. "Can't have vigilantes taking the law into their own hands. Those drifters have sworn statements about being attacked. Your word against theirs, and well, given your association with a known violent man, I know which testimony carries more weight." Ephraim had remained silent throughout the exchange, but now he spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "You're in their pocket. Railroads bought you same as they tried to buy those water rights." The sheriff's pleasant mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and hard beneath. He nodded to his deputies. "Take him to jail. We'll sort this out proper like at trial." "Ephraim," Sally started forward, but one of the deputies blocked her path. She could only watch as they marched him down the street, past the whispering onlookers. "Best run along home now, girl," Sheriff Yance said, his tone dripping with false concern. "Your pa must be worried sick about you, though I reckon he'll be more worried when he hears you've been keeping company with a killer." Sally stood in the street long after they'd gone, clutching her shawl against the cold. The townspeople gradually dispersed, leaving her alone with her churning thoughts. She had seen the calculation in the sheriff's eyes, the way he had been waiting for just such an opportunity. The railroad wanted their water rights, and now they had both the deed and a way to discredit anyone who might speak against them. Through the day, Sally walked the streets of town, seeking help. The general store owner turned away when she tried to speak to him. The banker closed his office door in her face. Even the telegraph operator, usually happy to gossip, became suddenly busy with his equipment when she approached. As afternoon faded toward evening, she found herself in front of the jail. The building squatted dark and solid, its barred windows like angry eyes. She knew Ephraim was in there, probably in one of the cells that faced the back alley. The thought of him caged like an animal made her heart ache. Night fell, bringing with it a bitter wind that cut through her shawl. Still, Sally stood before the jailhouse, her hands clasped in prayer. Her voice rose soft but clear in the darkness. "Dear Lord, you know the truth of what's happened here. You saw how these men twisted justice to serve their greed. Please, watch over Ephraim. Give him strength. Help me find a way to free him." Inside his cell, Ephraim sat on the narrow bunk, his broad shoulders hunched in the darkness. The familiar warmth of rage had been his companion through many dark nights. But now something else moved in his heart as Sally's voice carried through the barred window. "You know his heart, Lord," Sally continued, her words catching slightly. "I've seen the goodness in him, the mercy he showed when others would have chosen violence. Don't let them break his spirit. Don't let them make him bitter again." Ephraim bowed his head, overwhelmed by her steadfast faith. In all his years of solitude, no one had ever stood up for him like this. No one had seen past his scars and reputation to recognize the man he could be, the man she somehow believed he was. "Watch over him through this night," Sally prayed, her voice growing stronger. "Let him know he's not alone anymore. Let him feel your presence, even in that cold cell. And Lord, help us find a way to prove his innocence, to show everyone the truth of what happened." A deputy banged on the jail door. "Move along now! No loitering!" But Sally's voice continued, carried on the night wind. "Give me wisdom, Lord. Show me how to help him. And please, don't let him lose hope. Don't let him forget that you can make a way where there seems to be no way." Ephraim pressed his calloused hands against his face, feeling moisture there for the first time in years. The weight of Sally's loyalty, her unshakable belief in both God and him, pressed against the walls he had built around his heart. He remembered the hymn she had sung in the boarding house about amazing grace and being found when lost. Outside, Sally's prayer continued until her voice grew hoarse. The deputy eventually gave up trying to chase her away, retreating to his desk inside. The night grew colder, but she remained, her faith a warm beacon in the darkness. Finally, as the moon rose high over the sleeping town, Sally's voice grew softer but no less fervent. "Lord, whatever happens tomorrow, help us both stay strong. Help us remember that you are with us, even in this dark hour, and thank you for bringing Ephraim into my life, for letting me see the true heart of a good man." In his cell, Ephraim found himself mouthing words he hadn't spoken since childhood. Amen. The simple word felt strange on his lips, but something inside him shifted, like ice beginning to thaw. Sally's unwavering faith in him, her willingness to stand in the cold night defending him, it touched something he had thought long dead. The night grew deeper, and still Sally stood her vigil, her prayers a quiet song of hope in the darkness. Inside his cell, Ephraim listened, letting her words wash over him like healing water. Whatever came tomorrow, he knew one thing with certainty. He was no longer alone. Morning came too slowly for Sally. She had barely slept, her mind churning with worry for Ephraim. The first rays of sunlight found her already walking through the frosted streets toward the white-painted church where Reverend Miles lived. The church bell tolled 7 times as she climbed the worn steps to the parsonage door. Her knuckles had barely touched the wood when Reverend Miles opened it, as if he had been expecting her. "Child, I heard what happened yesterday," he said, ushering her inside. The parlor was warm, smelling of coffee and wood smoke. "Sister Martha told me everything." Sally sank into a cushioned chair, her shoulders drooping with exhaustion. "They took the deed, Reverend, and they've charged Ephraim with crimes he didn't commit. Those drifters who attacked me, they're lying, and the sheriff knows it." Reverend Miles poured her a cup of coffee, adding a generous spoonful of sugar. "The railroad's influence runs deep in this town," he said, his weathered face grave. "But we must not lose heart. The Lord sees all, even when justice seems far away." "But what can we do?" Sally wrapped her cold fingers around the warm cup. "No one will help us. They're all afraid of the railroad, or they believe the worst about Ephraim." The Reverend settled into his chair, stroking his gray beard thoughtfully. "Stand firm in your faith, Sally. Remember David before Goliath. The Lord uses the unlikely to accomplish his purposes. Your steadfast belief in Ephraim's goodness may be the very thing that helps him find his way back to God." Sally took a sip of coffee, letting its warmth strengthen her. "He's changing, Reverend. I've seen it. The way he chose mercy over violence when we recovered the deed. The way he listens when I pray or sing hymns." "Then continue to be his light," Reverend Miles said firmly, Your father taught you well in the scriptures. Use that knowledge to encourage him, and I will do what I can to help, starting with visiting him in his cell today." Hope flickered in Sally's heart as she left the parsonage, but that hope dimmed as she made her way through town, trying to rally support for Ephraim's cause. At the mercantile, Mrs. Henderson barely looked up from her ledger. "That cutter's nothing but trouble, girl. Best forget about him." The banker, Mr. Phillips, actually laughed when Sally tried to explain about the stolen deed. "A fine tale, Miss Brookfield, but everyone knows what kind of man Ephraim Cutter is. Violence follows him like a shadow." Even kind-hearted Miss Wilson at the post office shook her head. "Sally, dear, I know you want to see the good in everyone, but that man? Well, there's a reason folks fear him." By midday, Sally's feet ached from walking, and her spirit sagged under the weight of so many rejections. She found herself at the telegraph office, where she spent precious coins sending a message to her father. "Father, stop deed stolen by drifters. Stop Ephraim helped recover it. Stop now in jail on false charges. Stop need your help. Stop Sally." She knew it would take weeks for any reply to reach her. The mountain trails to their ranch were treacherous in winter, and the mail rider only came twice a month. Still, writing to her father made her feel less alone. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Sally returned to her room at the boarding house. She gathered her mother's old Bible and a shawl, then walked to the jail. The deputy at the desk barely glanced up as she settled onto the wooden bench outside, beneath the barred window she knew belonged to Ephraim's cell. Opening the Bible, her voice clear and steady, she began to read. "God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth be removed, and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea." Inside his cell, Ephraim sat on his narrow bunk, listening. The words washed over him like cool water on parched ground. He could picture Sally out there, wrapped in her shawl, defying the town's judgment to bring him comfort. "Though the waters thereof roar and be troubled, though the mountains shake with the swelling thereof." Sally's voice carried through the bars, strong with conviction. Ephraim's rough fingers gripped the cold iron bars. Shame for his violent past warred with a new feeling, gratitude for this woman who saw beyond his scars and reputation, who believed in him enough to sit in the cold, reading God's words to a man most thought beyond redemption. Sally continued reading as the sun sank lower, moving from Psalms to Isaiah. "Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you, yes, I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." For the first time in years, Ephraim felt tears burning behind his eyes. He remembered his mother reading these same words, before consumption took her and left him alone to face the world's cruelty. Since then, he had trusted only in his own strength, his own ability to survive. But Sally's steadfast presence, her unwavering faith in both God and him, was breaking down walls he had built around his heart. As darkness fell and lanterns flickered to life in the street, Ephraim did something he hadn't done since his mother died. He prayed. The words came hesitantly at first, silent but sincere. "Lord, if you're really there, if you can hear a man like me, help me be worthy of her faith. Help me find a way through this that don't end in violence." Sally's voice continued outside, reading stories of Daniel in the lion's den, of Joseph wrongly imprisoned, of God's faithful love through every trial. Each word seemed chosen to strengthen his resolve, to remind him that even in this cold cell he wasn't forgotten. The deputy came out twice more to tell Sally to leave, but she simply lowered her voice and continued reading. As night deepened, her words became a lifeline Ephraim clung to, a reminder that someone believed in his innocence, believed in him. "The Lord is my shepherd," Sally read, her voice growing hoarse but determined. "I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul." Ephraim pressed his forehead against the cold bars, letting the familiar words sink deep into his spirit. He had forgotten how much scripture he knew, how many verses his mother had taught him before she died. Now they came back, rising from some hidden place in his heart, joining with Sally's voice in the darkness. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." Outside, Sally's teeth chattered with cold, but she kept reading until the deputy finally insisted she leave. As she gathered her Bible and stood, her voice carried one last verse through the bars. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" In his cell, Ephraim whispered, "Amen." The word felt strange on his lips, but right somehow, like coming home after a long, dark journey. Sally's faith had kindled something in him he thought long dead, hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, there was still grace enough for a man like him. He lay down on his hard bunk, the memory of Sally's voice echoing in his mind. For the first time since his arrest, peace settled over him. Whatever came tomorrow, he wasn't facing it alone. God and Sally were with him, even here in this cell. Outside, Sally walked slowly back to the boarding house, clutching her Bible close. Her voice was nearly gone from reading, but her heart was full. She had seen Ephraim's shadow at the window, sensed how the words affected him. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, she had done what she could, shown him that faith and love could reach even through iron bars. The stars wheeled overhead, bright and cold in the mountain sky, as both Sally and Ephraim found rest at last, their hearts joined in quiet prayer for what lay ahead. Days crawled by like wounded animals. Sally watched the sun rise and set through the boarding house windows as she kneaded bread dough, scrubbed pots, and tried to keep her mind from dwelling on Ephraim alone in his cell. Mrs. Potter, the boarding house owner, had agreed to let Sally work for her meals, though her thin lips twisted with disapproval every time Sally passed through the kitchen. "Mind you don't break my good plates with those clumsy hands," Mrs. Potter would say, loud enough for the dining room to hear. The other kitchen girls would titter behind their aprons, whispering about the mountain man's woman. Sally bore it all with quiet dignity, though each barb stung. She focused on her work, finding comfort in the familiar motions of cooking. The heat of the stove kept her warm, at least, and the constant activity helped pass the hours until she could visit Ephraim again. Every evening, she would take her Bible and read to him through the jail window, ignoring the deputy's scowls. Sometimes Ephraim would speak a few words in response, his voice growing less gruff, more thoughtful with each passing day. Other times he remained silent, but she could feel him listening, sense his presence just beyond the bars. When Sunday arrived, Sally rose early. She pressed her best dress, the dark blue one that had belonged to her mother, and pinned her hair carefully. The morning air bit sharp and cold as she walked to church, but she held her head high. The little wooden church filled quickly. Sally felt the stairs as she took her usual seat near the front, but she kept her eyes forward, focused on the cross hanging behind the pulpit. Sheriff Yance sat in the back row, his badge gleaming in the weak winter sunlight that filtered through the windows. Reverend Miles began the service with a hymn. Sally's voice rose clear and strong above the congregation as they sang, "Amazing Grace." The familiar words wrapped around her like a warm shawl, strengthening her spirit. When the time came for prayer requests, Sally felt God's gentle nudge. Her hands trembled as she stood, but her voice remained steady. "I wish to speak," she said. A rustle of whispers swept through the church. Sheriff Yance shifted in his seat, his spurs jingling softly. "Brothers and sisters," Sally continued, her heart pounding but her faith firm, "I stand before you today to declare my trust in the Lord's justice. Though evil men may scheme and the innocent suffer, God's truth will prevail. I ask for your prayers, not just for Ephraim Cutter, who sits unjustly accused, but for our town, that we might remember mercy and seek honest judgment." She sat down, her cheeks burning but her spirit lifted. A heavy silence filled the church, broken only by the soft creak of wooden pews. Reverend Miles stood slowly, his kind eyes sweeping across the congregation. He opened his Bible and began to preach, his voice carrying to every corner of the sanctuary. "Today we shall speak of mercy," he said, "and of justice. True justice, not the kind that bends to power or profit." His gaze settled briefly on Sheriff Yance. "Our Lord tells us, 'Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy.' And what is mercy, my friends, but justice tempered with grace?" The sermon that followed was like an arrow straight to the conscience. The Reverend spoke of false witnesses, of corrupt judges, of those who used the law to oppress the weak. Though he never mentioned Ephraim or the railroad directly, his meaning was clear to all. Sheriff Yance left before the final hymn, his boot heels striking hard against the wooden floor as he strode out. Sally remained in her pew after the service ended, letting the crowds thin before she made her way to the door. The afternoon sun had begun its descent when Sally finally stepped outside the church. Her mind was still full of Reverend Miles's words about mercy when she noticed a tall figure waiting beneath the bare branches of the old cottonwood tree. The man stood straight and dignified, his dark eyes watching her with careful consideration. He wore a mixture of native and Western clothing, a cotton shirt and wool vest over buckskin leggings, with a traditional blanket draped across his shoulders against the cold. A well-worn Winchester rifle was slung across his back. "Miss Brookfield," he said, his English clear but measured. "I am Nakai Begay. I must speak with you about Ephraim Cutter." Sally's heart quickened, but she showed no fear. There was something in the man's bearing that spoke of honor and purpose. "How do you know Mr. Cutter?" she asked. Nakai's expression remained serious as he spoke. 3 winters ago, during the border troubles, I led my family group north to better hunting grounds. We crossed paths with a military patrol. They had orders to force all Navajo back to the reservation, even those with permission to hunt. He paused, his eyes distant with memory. The soldiers were angry, eager for violence, but Ephraim Cutter was there, working as a scout. He stepped between their rifles and my people, said he'd shoot any man who fired on women and children. The commander backed down. Ephraim Cutter saved my family that day, though it cost him his job with the army. Sally felt tears prick at her eyes. This was the man the town feared as a killer, a man who had risked everything to protect innocent lives. "The old ones say that a life debt must be repaid," Nakai continued. "I have waited for the right time. Now I hear he sits in jail, accused by corrupt men. I will speak for him. I will tell what I know of his true character." Hope blazed in Sally's chest like a signal fire. "You would testify? Before the judge?" Nakai nodded solemnly. "I have also heard things about the railroad men, how they forge papers, steal water rights from both white and native peoples. My words may help prove their dishonesty." Sally wanted to embrace him, but restrained herself, knowing it would not be appropriate. Instead, she clasped her hands together, unable to hold back her tears of relief. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for coming forward." Do not thank me, Nakai replied. I only repay what I owe. Among my people, we say that a man's true worth is measured not by his wealth or power, but by his actions toward those weaker than himself. Ephraim Cutter proved his worth that day. Now I will prove mine. They spoke for a while longer, making plans to meet with Reverend Miles the next day. As the sun sank toward the mountains, Nakai pulled his blanket closer and prepared to leave. Where will you stay? Sally asked, concerned. I have made camp outside town, he said. It is better this way. Some here still look at my people with suspicion. Sally nodded, understanding but saddened by this truth. God bless you, Mr. Begay. Your courage gives me hope. The holy people teach that truth, like water, will always find its way to the surface, Nakai replied. Keep faith, Miss Brookfield. Justice may come slowly, but it will come. She watched him walk away, his straight figure disappearing into the gathering dusk. For the first time in days, real hope stirred in her heart. That night, when she read to Ephraim through his cell window, her voice carried a new strength. God has sent us help, she told him softly. Nakai Begay has come. Through the bars, she heard Ephraim's sharp intake of breath. Nakai? The Navajo scout? He remembers what you did for his family. He's going to testify for you. There was a long silence. Finally, Ephraim spoke, his voice rough with emotion. I never expected anyone to remember that day. God remembers, Sally said gently, and he sends help in his own time. That night, both Sally and Ephraim slept more peacefully than they had in days. Outside the jail, the stars wheeled overhead, bright and cold in the mountain sky. And in his camp beyond the town's edge, Nakai kept watch, ready to speak truth to power when morning came. Morning sunlight glinted off fresh snow as Sally and Nakai approached the courthouse steps. The building's weathered boards creaked beneath their feet, and Sally's heart hammered against her ribs. Reverend Miles waited for them at the entrance, his Bible tucked under one arm, his expression determined. Sheriff Yance lounged against the doorframe, toying with his badge. When he spotted them, his mouth twisted into a mocking smile. Well now, if it ain't the preacher man, the fat girl, and a savage come to waste the court's time. His laugh echoed across the porch. Judge Crawford ain't likely to take kindly to Indian testimony. The Lord sees all hearts equally, Reverend Miles said firmly, stepping forward. And this court will hear the truth, Sheriff, whether you like it or not. Inside, the courtroom was already packed. Townsfolk filled the wooden benches, their whispers rising like wind through prairie grass. Sally saw the drifters who had robbed her sitting near the front, cleaned up and wearing borrowed suit coats that didn't quite fit. Their leader, Jed Pike, smirked at her. Ephraim sat at the defendant's table, his massive frame making the chair look small. His hands were still shackled, but he held himself straight and proud. When he saw Sally, something softened in his eyes. Judge Crawford, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, called the court to order. The sound of his gavel made Sally jump. The drifters testified first. One by one they spun their lies, claiming Ephraim had attacked them without provocation and stolen their rightful property. Pike spoke with practiced smoothness about how they'd found the deed abandoned and were simply trying to return it to the railroad company, its legitimate owner. Sally's fingers dug into her skirts as she listened. She could see silver dollars glinting in the drifters' pockets, railroad money buying their false witness. When Nakai stood to testify, a murmur ran through the courthouse. He walked to the front with quiet dignity, his moccasins silent on the wooden floor. Your Honor, Reverend Miles said, this man has traveled far to speak truth about Ephraim Cutter's character. Judge Crawford peered over his spectacles. The court will hear him, though I remind you that Indian testimony carries less weight." Nakai's voice filled the courtroom, steady and clear. He told of that winter day 3 years ago, how Ephraim had faced down armed soldiers to protect innocent women and children, how he'd chosen justice over orders, mercy over violence. "Among my people, we say a man's heart shows in his choices," Nakai said. "That day, Ephraim Cutter showed his heart. He is no thief, no murderer. He is a protector of the weak." Then Nakai spoke of the railroad's dealings with his tribe. He described men in fine suits presenting papers, promising one thing but writing another, how they'd taken water rights through false deeds, leaving native families to thirst. "The same men who cheat my people now seek to steal from Miss Brookfield's family," he said. "They use the same methods: false papers, paid liars, corrupt officials." The courthouse erupted in shocked whispers. Sheriff Yance's face had turned red with anger. Sally stood then, her legs shaking but her voice strong. From her pocket, she drew out the original deed, the one Reverend Miles had quietly retrieved from the church lockbox while the sheriff wasn't watching. "Your Honor," she said, "this is my father's true deed to our water rights. It bears the territorial seal and proper signatures. The railroad's claim is built on lies, just as their case against Ephraim Cutter is built on lies." Judge Crawford held out his hand for the document. The courthouse fell silent as he studied it, comparing it to the railroad's filing. "The territorial seal on the railroad's deed," he said slowly, "appears to be forged." Sheriff Yance surged to his feet. "Your Honor, you can't take the word of a girl and an Indian over—" "I can and I will, Sheriff," Judge Crawford cut him off sharply. "The evidence speaks for itself." He turned to the drifters, who were already edging toward the door. "And you men will remain here to answer charges of perjury." Sally's heart soared as she watched the judge write his ruling. Beside her, Reverend Miles smiled and patted her hand. Nakai stood tall and dignified, his testimony given, his debt repaid. And Ephraim, Sally turned to see him watching her with wonder in his eyes, as if seeing sunshine after a long storm. Justice, like truth, had found its way to the surface at last. Judge Crawford's gavel struck with finality. "This court finds the defendant, Ephraim Cutter, not guilty of all charges. Release him immediately." The pronouncement echoed through the stunned courthouse. Deputy Wilson hurried forward with iron keys jangling, his hands trembling slightly as he unlocked Ephraim's shackles. The heavy restraints fell away with a clank that seemed to shake loose the last chains of injustice. Sheriff Yance stood rigid by the prosecution table, his face mottled red with fury. His fingers drummed against his gun belt as he watched his case crumble. "This ain't over," he muttered, but his threat carried no weight now. The drifters who had testified falsely didn't wait for the judge's final words. They scrambled from their seats, shoving past onlookers in their haste to escape. Jed Pike's borrowed suit coat caught on a bench nail, tearing as he fled. Their boot heels thundered across the wooden floor and down the courthouse steps. "Let them run," Reverend Miles said softly to Sally. "The Lord's justice moves faster than any man's feet." Ephraim rose slowly from the defendant's chair, his massive frame unfolding like a grizzly waking from winter sleep. He rubbed his wrists where the shackles had bitten, leaving angry red marks on his skin. His eyes found Sally's across the courtroom, and something powerful passed between them. "Court is adjourned," Judge Crawford announced, gathering his papers. The spectators began to file out, their whispers building to a steady hum of excitement. This would be talked about in every home and store in town before sundown. Ephraim strode through the parting crowd, his presence commanding respect, where once it had inspired fear. He paused only to grasp Nakai's forearm in silent gratitude. The Navajo man nodded once, his mission of honor fulfilled. Sally stood waiting by the courthouse doors, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. The morning sunlight streaming through the windows caught the droplets, making them shine like diamonds. Her hands trembled at her sides, but she held herself straight and proud. Without hesitation, Ephraim crossed to her. His scarred hands, rough from years of mountain living, reached out to take hers with surprising gentleness. The touch silenced every whisper in the courthouse. Even Sheriff Yance stopped his angry muttering to watch. "Sally," Ephraim's deep voice carried clearly through the hushed room. "You stood by me when all others turned away. You saw past what people said I was, to who I truly am." He squeezed her hands, his eyes never leaving hers. "I swear before God and these witnesses, I'll never let shame touch you again." A sob caught in Sally's throat. Gone was any trace of the frightened girl who had stumbled through snow to his cabin door. In her place stood a woman of quiet strength, her faith vindicated, her dignity restored. Reverend Miles stepped forward, his Bible cradled in his arms. The morning light through the high windows cast his shadow long across the courthouse floor. "The Lord restores what was stolen," he said, laying one hand on Sally's shoulder and one on Ephraim's. "He makes beauty from ashes and turns mourning into dancing." The townsfolk who remained watched in awed silence as Ephraim tucked Sally's hand into the crook of his arm. Together they walked toward the courthouse doors, their steps matched and unhurried. Sally's head was held high, no longer ducking to avoid cruel stares. Ephraim's fierce protective stance dared anyone to mock or whisper. The heavy doors swung open, letting in a rush of cold mountain air. Fresh snow had fallen during the trial, covering the muddy street in pristine white. Sally and Ephraim stepped out into that clean brightness, leaving behind the musty courthouse with its memories of false accusations and hard-won justice. From his position on the porch, Reverend Miles watched them go, a gentle smile playing at his lips. The Lord's ways were mysterious indeed, bringing together the feared mountain man and the mocked ranch girl, healing them both through love and courage. The courthouse slowly emptied behind them. Sheriff Yance skulked away toward his office, his authority diminished. The last townsfolk dispersed, hurrying to spread the news of the morning's events. Soon only the fresh tracks of 2 pairs of boots marked the new-fallen snow, the footprints of a man and woman walking forward together, heads held high into whatever tomorrow might bring. The ranch house came into view as Sally and Ephraim crested the last hill. Smoke curled from the chimney into the crisp mountain air, and a lone figure stood in the yard, shading his eyes against the setting sun. Sally's father, Thomas Brookfield, had grown gaunt with worry. During her absence, his clothes hung loose on his frame. "Pa!" Sally called out, spurring her borrowed horse forward. Thomas Brookfield stumbled through the snow toward them, his weathered face streaked with tears. "My girl," he choked out, as Sally dismounted and ran to him. "I feared the worst when you didn't return." Ephraim hung back, giving them space for their reunion. He watched as Sally pressed the rescued deed into her father's trembling hands. Thomas clutched the papers to his chest, shoulders shaking with relief. Word spread quickly through the scattered homesteads. By sundown, neighbors began arriving, drawn by curiosity about Sally's return and the mysterious mountain man who accompanied her. They gathered in the ranch yard, whispering among themselves as Ephraim helped Thomas repair broken fence posts without a word. "Never thought I'd see the day," Martha Wilson murmured to her husband. "The killer and the fat girl, saving the ranch together." But there was no mockery in their tones now, only wonder. They watched as Ephraim hauled water from the creek, his strength making quick work of the daily chore that had nearly broken Thomas's back. Sally moved confidently through the crowd, sharing the story of their journey while she prepared a hearty supper of salt pork and beans. Inside the warm kitchen, Sally's clear voice lifted in a gentle hymn as she worked. The familiar words of amazing grace drifted through the house, touching something long buried in Ephraim's heart. When the food was ready, the neighbors gathered around the Brookfields' worn table, squeezing close on benches and borrowed chairs. Thomas looked to Ephraim. "Would you give thanks, friend?" A hush fell over the room. Ephraim's hands, rough from years of mountain living, clenched briefly on the table's edge. Then slowly, for the first time in decades, he bowed his head. "Lord," his deep voice rumbled uncertainly, "thank you for bringing us home safe, for this food, for—" He paused, swallowing hard. "For sending Sally to my door that night. Amen." Sally's eyes shone with tears as she began passing bowls of steaming food. Outside, snow fell softly in the gathering dusk, but inside the ranch house, faith and family warmed every corner. Thomas clasped Ephraim's shoulder as he reached for the bread, a gesture of acceptance that needed no words. The feared mountain man had found his way home at last. Spring crept into the Colorado Rockies like a gentle awakening. Snow melted from fence posts, revealing weathered wood beneath. The mountain stream, once contested by the railroad, ran clear and strong through Brookfield land. A letter arrived one morning, its Denver postmark crisp. The railroad company formally withdrew all claims to the water rights. Sally stood on the porch, reading the letter aloud to her father and Ephraim. Her voice, steady and confident now, carried across the yard where purple wildflowers had begun to push through the thinning snow. Thomas Brookfield clasped his daughter's shoulder, pride shining in his eyes. In town, changes bloomed like the spring itself. Where once there had been whispers and mockery, Sally now received respectful nods. The general storekeeper who had once sneered at her held the door open, calling her Miss Brookfield with genuine warmth. Even Mrs. Wilson, who had led much of the gossip, invited Sally to help with the church social. Ephraim noticed the shift, too. Men who had once crossed the street to avoid him now offered handshakes and greetings. "Morning, Cutter," they'd say, meeting his eyes without fear. Yet whispers still followed the pair. Speculation about the mountain man and the ranch girl who had defied the railroad together. One evening, as sunset painted the mountains gold, Ephraim and Sally walked the fence line, checking for winter damage. They paused at the highest point of the property, where the view stretched across valleys still touched with patches of snow. Ephraim's shoulders carried the weight of unspoken words. "There's blood on these hands," he finally said, his voice rough with emotion. "Years ago, I let anger rule me, killed men who might have had families of their own, chose exile instead of facing what I'd done." He stared at his scarred fingers. "Lived bitter and alone, cursing God and man alike." Sally reached for his weathered hand, her touch gentle but firm. "The Lord gave me to you so you'd know mercy again," she said softly. "Those men meant me to die in that snow, but you opened your door. That's the man you truly are, Ephraim." They stood together, watching evening shadows stretch across the saved land. A meadowlark's song carried on the spring breeze. Ephraim's grip tightened on Sally's hand, accepting at last that his life would no longer be measured by violence or fear, but by the mercy he had shown on a bitter winter night. The church bell's deep tone rolled across the valley, calling the community to gather. Spring sunshine warmed the wooden steps of the little mountain church as townsfolk filed in, their Sunday best brightened by touches of color, a yellow ribbon here, a flowered bonnet there. The sanctuary filled quickly, pews creaking under the weight of ranchers, shopkeepers, and families who had witnessed the long struggle for justice. Reverend Miles stood at the pulpit, his weathered Bible open before him. Beside it lay the Brookfield deed, its corners soft from handling, but its words still clear and true. Shafts of morning light streamed through the high windows, dust motes dancing in the golden beams. Today, the Reverend's voice carried to the rafters, we witness the Lord's provision. He lifted the deed, paper rustling in the hushed sanctuary. Let it be known and recorded that the water rights of Brookfield Ranch, flowing from Silver Creek to the eastern boundary, are hereby confirmed in perpetuity. Sally sat in the front pew, her father beside her, both their faces shining with grateful tears. Ephraim occupied the space next to her, his massive frame somehow softer now, less threatening. His scarred hands rested quietly in his lap. When the time came for music, Sally rose and made her way to the front. No whispers followed her now, no mocking glances at her size. She stood tall, dignity wrapped around her like a mantle. The first notes of Amazing Grace filled the sanctuary, her voice clear and strong, reaching every corner of the church. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. The words seemed to pierce Ephraim's heart. He rose slowly from his seat and moved forward, each step heavy with meaning. Before the entire congregation, he knelt at the altar rail, his scarred head bowing in prayer. Sunlight caught the silver in his hair, transforming it to a gentle halo. Sally's voice never wavered as she continued singing, but her hand found its way to Ephraim's broad shoulder, offering strength and acceptance. When the final note faded into reverent silence, they rose together. The fearsome mountain man and the once mocked girl stood side by side, transformed by grace into something new and whole. Outside, after the service, spring worked its gentle magic on the land. Snow retreated from the mountainsides, feeding crystal streams that tumbled toward the valleys. The air carried the scent of wet earth and growing things. Townspeople lingered on the church steps, offering handshakes to Ephraim and warm embraces to Sally. Even those who had once crossed the street to avoid the killer now sought his counsel on mountain trails and weather signs. As evening approached, they made their way to Ephraim's cabin, no longer a lonely outpost, but a place where hope had first taken root. The hearth glowed with welcome, casting warm light on the buffalo robe that had once wrapped a desperate girl on a winter night. Sally moved about the cabin, her presence filling the space with life and purpose. She sang as she worked, her voice carrying out through the open door and into the gathering dusk. The melody drifted across pine-covered slopes and along rushing streams, telling a story of redemption to the listening mountains. Inside, Ephraim watched her with wonder, marveling at how mercy had found him in his exile and led him home. The lamplight caught the tears on his cheeks as Sally's song filled the cabin with promise. This place of solitude had become a sanctuary of grace, where two wounded souls had found healing in each other's strength. Outside, spring waters rushed toward tomorrow, carrying hope like a blessing through the greening land. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.